Hello, and welcome back to Straw Planet Podcasts with me, your host, Jack Cole. So today I'm joined by Dr. Jonny Hanson, who's joining us from Northern Ireland. So first of all, Dr. Hanson, welcome. Thank you for your time, and start by telling us a little bit about your background in conservation and your book and the work that you've been doing recently.
Sure. Afternoon, Jack. It's great to be on the show with you. Thank you for having me. So I'm a environmental social scientist that works at the intersection of conservation, agriculture, and enterprise. So I don't study nature per se. I study our relationship with the natural world. That relationship is one that we hold as individuals, but it's also one that we hold collectively in social groups. And that brings us sometimes into conflict with others who hold different perspectives on the past, the present, the future, on wildlife, on nature, and visions for the land. And in partly, I work at the interface of conservation and agriculture because I come from a farming background, a generation removed. So I really love farming. It's as a way of life and being, but I also grew up loving nature and wildlife. And yet, if we want to have a vibrant and flourishing planet, we need to find ways for nature to share landscapes outside of core protected areas. And that often means wildlife being in landscapes where farming is taking place, whether it's ranching or the many different types of farming that there are. So I work to find ways for conservation and agriculture to coexist, to share landscapes. Of all the species that I'm most interested in, the ones that stand out for me and that have shaped my career so far are large carnivores and apex predators. And they're particularly challenging to share landscapes with if you are a livestock farmer. And so I spent many years doing research in Nepal with supporting the work of the Snow Leopard Conservancy and Nepali colleagues there, looking at how farmers and snow leopard conservation and tourism and all of these different things could share mountain landscapes in the Himalaya, the Everest and Annapurna region. But more recently, I've started to think about that in relation to my native islands of Britain and Ireland, because the likelihood of large carnivore reintroductions happening in these islands, particularly of lynx, is increasing every year. And yet I saw that there were gaps in terms of engagement with farmers, consultation with farmers, and also thinking about the practical ways that we can use to manage and govern coexistence between livestock farming and large carnivore conservation. So I set off on an adventure that took me 29,000 kilometers across the Western Europe and North America. And I took me to 56 different people and organizations over 7 countries from all walks of life. And the results of that are a report, a technical report, which was out in June, and then this popular science book, which is really the story behind the science. So it's been a whistle stop tour, but it's uncovered lots of interesting answers and also posed lots of questions. But in my rationale, my reason and my motivation, my passion in writing it is to act as a guide for citizens in Britain and Ireland who are thinking about the reintroduction of apex predators and to really delve into the issues and the complexities and the multiple points of view, of which I myself hold multiple points of view. There is a part of me that thinks this is such a fantastic idea. And if I could wave my magic wand and lived in an ideal world, I would wave my magic wand and make it happen. And yet at the same time, there is a part of me that sees the potential for political and social conflict over this in Britain and in Ireland. And that's something I've seen on my travels, and that makes me quite wary of it. So I've written this book for everyone whose feelings like mine are mixed, or for people whose feelings are fixed, to help us really think through the issues and the evidence of this topic.
Yes, and within your work, there is rewilding, okay, which is all the rage at the moment.
Indeed.
So you tell us a little bit about what is rewilding and how can its principles be implemented into conservation practices?
Yeah, so rewilding is one of those terms. I guess it's a bit like sustainability, that is, its great strength is its breadth, so you can take it to mean almost anything. But my working definition is that it is returning natural processes to landscapes. So the three P's, so the first is process, the return of natural processes. So grazing and browsing and excreting and all of these things, and particularly the management of vegetation. So that's the first P, the return of processes, usually by plant eaters, often large ones, herds of large herbivores, but that can also include keystone species like beavers. So that's the second P is plant eaters. And the third P is predators. So to complete that picture, you ideally want predators to help manage that ecosystem, to exert that pressure on the plant eater populations, and to have what is called in ecological terms the trophic cascades that then move down through the layers of the food web or the food chain. And we, of course, can function to an extent as apex predators, whether that's through farming with using, say, domestic cattle or horses in a rewilding project, or we can also function in that capacity to an extent as hunters. So, say, hunting deer, culling or controlling deer numbers where their overpopulation is a barrier to, say, reforestation. But we don't have quite the same effect as wild apex predators do. We don't have quite the same ecological benefits and effects. So a big part of rewilding is whether we, at least in this country, is whether we should and could return those apex predators to complete that rewilding package, to add the third P to the three Ps of my rewilding definition. One of the things that I like very much about rewilding is that it is not trying to set the clock back and try and find some romanticized primeval version of the past, because I started out, I was trained in history. First, the past is a foreign country. You can't go back to the past, you can only go forward. And rewilding is about envisioning, to me, it's about envisioning a different future, a future where we have more nature instead of less nature, where nature is, instead of being on the back foot as it has been across the world and in these islands for so many decades, that nature is on the front foot, and we are restoring processes, and we're restoring plant eaters and maybe restoring predators as well. So I think there's a lot of optimism in the rewilding movement. I think there's a lot of energy that I see, and whether or not that is going to involve predators in the process of rewilding in Britain and Ireland, well, that remains to be seen.
Okay, so within Britain, of course, we think of our islands as empty of large carnivores, particular something that comes, we think of the past. And I was wondering, what is the actual background of large carnivores in Britain and Ireland, and what would be the pros and cons of bringing them back, and which species are we talking about as well?
Yeah, so in my study and in my book, I've looked at three species. So I've looked at brown bears, I've looked at grey wolves, and I've looked at Eurasian lynx. So brown bears, large, very large carnivore, 3 to 4 times the size of an adult male human. Grey wolves, large wild canine, the size of, say, a German Shepherd, and then lynx, medium-sized cat, about the size of a Springer Spaniel or a Labrador. And over the last centuries and millennia, we have lost all of these species in these islands. Whether that, particularly with wolves, there was more of an active persecution. So they were a threat to monastic sheep holdings in the Middle Ages. They were a threat to the royal deer hunting grounds of the Middle Ages. In the early modern period in Ireland, Oliver Cromwell, who is not a popular figure in Ireland for his ethnic cleansing and pogroms, at the same time started to systematically exterminate wolves to speed up the colonization of Ireland. But with wolves is a very clear historical record of people purposely trying to get rid of them. With lynx and bears, it's a bit more vague, because particularly with lynx, like any cat species, they're so cryptic. There is very little evidence. And they probably lived alongside us, perhaps even longer than the evidence would suggest. So the most recent evidence for lynx is the early medieval period. So I think around 600-700 AD. So Viking Saxons, that kind of period. But there is some emerging literary evidence that there may have been lynx in Scotland right up until about the 1700s, which would extend their presence in the island of Britain by about 1,000 years. With bears are not quite as cryptic and elusive as lynx, and there's some evidence from history of bears being, historical records tell us, exported from Scotland to the imperial circus in Rome. And so there's also evidence in Ireland of butchery marks on bear bones in caves. So there was certainly hunting of bears going on, both for entertainment purposes for the Roman circus, and also because I guess we were eating them or hunting them on occasion. So directly in those cases, we were using predators, but also there was competition, probably for space and land. So as agriculture expanded and brought us and our herds of livestock into places, the wilder, more remote parts of these islands, probably the last refuges of these species, then over time they vanished from our islands. And for hundreds and thousands of years, they were gone, and there was no discussion really about their return. But in the last couple of decades, and especially in the last couple of years, as part of the rewilding movement, the discussions about their potential return have really started to pick up pace. Not so much with bears. I have yet to see any studies on the reintroduction of bears, and that is because there is a greater risk to human life from bears. Brown bears are the one species on my travels across the world where I have felt scared at times. They can do a lot of damage, and so no one that I've seen is seriously considering bear reintroductions. With wolves, there's been a study about the habitat suitability in Scotland and also a study of habitat suitability in Ireland. And there's been lots of discussions, mainly more like 5 to 10 years ago, about some very wealthy and large Scottish landowners potentially reintroducing species, but like wolves and particularly wolves. But wolves are tricky. They are extremely intelligent and adaptable animals that roam in packs over large areas. They can use landscapes that people are using. They will take sheep. They can potentially hunt cattle and horses. And they also have in human culture and folklore just this outsized, larger than life persona that means they really tend to be a love them or hate them species. And that's not just confined to Western culture. My PhD fieldwork sites in Nepal were in the Everest and Annapurna regions, and wolves were not present when I was doing my fieldwork in 2013-14. I went back, or I did a follow-up study with my Nepali colleagues a couple of years later, and wolves had returned to both sites. And people were losing less livestock or the similar amounts of livestock to snow leopards than they were to wolves. But people were really, really angry about wolves. So wolves can be tricky. And we can see that in Europe at the moment with the recent furor over the downgrading of the wolf's legal protected status within the EU. So that leaves us in the absence of concrete plans to reintroduce wolves to Britain or Ireland at the moment. That leaves us and leads us to lynx, which are a solitary cat species. That solitary cat species are relatively unobtrusive in the landscape. You will probably never see a lynx in Britain. I have yet to see a snow leopard, despite all the time I've spent in Nepal. Although, to be fair, as a social scientist, I was interviewing people rather than trying to track snow leopards. But the challenge, the good news with lynx is that they are really good at hunting deer. And in Britain, we have a major problem with deer. We have, in some places, an overpopulation of deer. And we have several invasive species of deer. And lynx would be particularly good at, they tend to hunt roe deer, but they will take Chinese water deer and muntjac deer. They could probably take sika deer, which is another invasive species, possibly smaller fallow deer as well. So lynx could have a really great role in reducing the number of deer, but as an apex predator species, they also change the behavior of deer, and that's some of the findings that came out of those famous studies in Yellowstone in the 1990s. So they changed the areas of the landscape that deer occur in. So that's the good news with reintroducing lynx. The bad news, and the bit where I have brought my interest in agriculture and conservation and trying to build bridges between these worlds, is that same hunting capacity that lynx have and that phenomenal power to weight ratio that cats do. They are power athletes, stealth fighters, means they can also catch sheep. And across Europe, the number of sheep that the average lynx will take per year varies very widely, from 0 in some cases right the way through to Norway, where it has been up to 10 sheep per lynx per year. And that potential to hunt sheep, even though we don't know exactly what it could be like in Britain in terms of the number, is the particular challenge in reintroducing. They're no threat to people. I don't really think that they're a threat to pets, domestic pets, but they are certainly a threat to livestock. And that is the challenge then of finding ways to manage that process to make sure that farmers' concerns are met. and that we put in place management and governance approaches that try to stop lynx from killing sheep and livestock, that compensate them financially when they do, that have mechanisms in place to remove, or potentially, as challenging as it is to talk about this, to sometimes cull or lethally control a problem predator that just has developed a really bad habit. Those are part of what I call the coexistence toolkit. And then there are the more positive tools like tourism. And tourism is one of the big arguments for having these animals back, because we can see the potential from them, not just the problems. And the last tool in my coexistence toolkit is governance. So that's policies and procedures and stakeholder forums where you have farmers and rewilders and tourism entrepreneurs and government officials all meeting together to discuss how they share a landscape together, even though they have different values and different visions for that landscape. It sounds really boring, governance, but it is probably the most important part of reintroducing large carnivores, because, and this is the big take-home message for your listeners, is that coexisting with carnivores is less about conflict between people and predators, and it is much more about conflict between people over predators. So that reintroduction of lynx are a biological species, and they have a profound ecological role. But because we live on an island, and that island status of our nation made extinction more likely and means that it cannot be reversed ecologically, it means that only we can bring them back. And that makes reintroducing a social process. And social processes, because of the species involved, are always complicated.
Of course, and you alluded to there that part of, I'd say the problem or an obstacle is the human psyche itself. I was wondering if you might share with us what part that has been playing in this whole process of trying to get these species back, and then sort of navigating how it is. Because you mentioned at the beginning that you've very much been working with and hearing the perspectives of farmers. I'm really curious to know what you learned from then, and then also, as I say, how that might feed into the human psyche.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Jack, a really good question. And I would say that generally in conservation, it has been driven and dominated by natural science, because we're studying and working with the natural world. So we need that foundation of natural science. But it's also a social process. I would argue it's still something that people are doing based on visions and values, even if it is mainly about stepping back. That's still we're choosing not to do something. And so to understand that social process, we need social science. And there's more and more social science in conservation, which is great. But I would say that one of the main social sciences that are missing is, or that are less common than economics or human geography, which my PhD was in, is psychology. And yet, particularly with these species, particularly with apex predators, psychology is absolutely critical, because everything that we see and understand about the world around us, about those outer landscapes, whether it's the beautiful rainforest behind your head or the Himalaya of Nepal that I spent time tramping around, or the upland and forested landscapes of these islands that we know and love so much, everything we know and perceive about them is transmitted through our inner landscapes, where we have beliefs and values and perceptions. And so what I'm saying is there's this objective reality of nature around us, but as a social scientist, I believe that that objective reality is always interpreted subjectively. And that means particularly with large carnivores. And I think that we can put this down to two things. We can put it down to evolution. We evolved with these species on the plains of Africa, or their ancestors did alongside our ancestors. And also then through this back catalogue of fairy tales, where we have distilled human history into these stories, often simplistic ones, and usually ones where the large predators are the baddies. They're the bad guys, the villains in a lot of stories, right up to the present day, with the likes of most Disney films that I've seen growing up. In those stories, our relationship with predators often tends to become polarized. So we tend to have this, on one hand, we romanticize them. We project onto them. In my case, with the snow leopard, it's my spirit animal. I project myself this lone cat of the mountains because I love spending time in the mountains. I project onto this cat all of these things. Snow leopard knows nothing about me or has nothing to do with me, but I project onto that snow leopard all of these things, and it has profoundly shaped my career. It's extraordinary. I've never even seen one in the wild. On the other hand, we can demonize these species, especially wolves, and we can project onto them our fears and this baggage of our evolutionary past when these animals hunted us and we were food, like uh, whether it was bears or wolves or big cats in Africa or across the world. And we often tend to either romanticize or demonize. We love or we hate, and we wonder or we fear. And that understanding of these animals in our inner landscapes, in our psyche, then translates into action in our outer landscapes, because those polarized perspectives on predators often translate into polarized politics on predators. Because politics, as we've seen with elections in the world right throughout 2024, politics is not just about fact, it's about emotion. And with large carnivores, just like with politics, it's not just about fact, it's about emotion. It's about perception as much as reality. So understanding our inner landscapes, understanding the human psyche, to me has been the missing part in understanding our coexistence with predators. And it is, alongside governance, absolutely critical to understanding how we might relate to them if they return, but also to the process of returning them. So when I talk to farmers about that, and I went to farmers, I talked to all of the main farming unions across Britain and Ireland, and a couple of livestock organisations, a couple of rewilding organisations actively involved in reintroductions. And then I talked to 46 people from all walks of life across the world. And I wanted to ask them what they thought about these different, in terms of the British and Irish interviewees, the different ways we could manage coexistence if lynx and wolves return, and also these different ways that we could govern it. So I would say, then this is what's done in Colorado, this is what's done in Wyoming, this is what's done in the Netherlands, Switzerland. What do you think about this working here? What do you think about livestock guardian dogs, or compensation schemes versus insurance schemes, or tourism versus predator-friendly certification schemes? What I hadn't anticipated before we even got to that was their perceptions of the context in which reintroductions are being proposed. That there have been huge numbers of changes in agriculture, particularly since Brexit, and even the agri-environmental schemes, the subsidy schemes that incentivize farmers to protect nature. There's been a lot of uncertainty. There's ongoing uncertainty at the moment about what those look like. There have been trade deals on the cards. There's tax changes recently that have taken place. And so reintroductions are not happening in a vacuum, or the discussion of reintroductions. They're happening in a context, which for the farmers that I interviewed is an unstable and chaotic context. And so this is where perception comes in. To them, potentially, and to many other farmers across Britain, the reintroduction of lynx is not some romanticized return to a primordial or primeval past, or a primordial or primeval vision of the future. It is an attempt by urban elites to foist another ill-thought-through scheme onto rural people who are struggling to make ends meet and keep the show on the road. Now, the facts on the ground are the same. Reintroduction of lynx is a reintroduction of lynx. The species itself is a lynx, is a lynx, is a lynx. But those perspectives on what that process is, that is where the conflict is, in my estimation. But that also means that there's room to communicate to solve those misperceptions that we can have, to get farmers in a room with rewilders and farmers to say, well, I see the lynx as this symbol of urban elites overreaching and interfering in rural areas, and for rewilders to say, well, I see the lynx as this symbol of a different future where nature is on the front foot instead of the back foot, and to have those conversations. So in terms of a way forward and finding solutions to the challenges of living with these animals, as well as the opportunities, there we get back to communications and governance. So having different groups in a room, sitting down, talking face to face, and treating each other as human beings and not as implacable opponents. If we want large carnivore reintroductions to work in these islands, then those sort of approaches are going to be absolutely crucial.
And in completing your book, you interviewed people from abroad, spectrum of
I,
backgrounds.
I can't hear you, Jack.
Oh, hello, hello. Are you
You,
with me? Can you
you've
hear me?
gone very quiet.
So, in preparation for your book, you completed a number of interviews from a broad spectrum of people with different backgrounds, as well as the farmers, which is fascinating to hear about. What are some of the ones that stood out for you and why?
Yeah. Well, I've kind of talked about my 10 British and Irish interviews. All of those were done
Oh,
remotely.
mm,
But I then went off on this big journey across Western Europe and North America, and I had 46 visits and interviews, and that was rewilders through to hunters, entrepreneurs, government officials, people from all walks of life, and people with all different points of view on large carnivores and their return, which can be challenging, particularly for farmers when they return after long absences, and especially when people bring them back. That's kind of the summary of what we've discussed so far. There were, there were just so many inspiring people that I met. It's hard to tie it down to one or two, but I'm going to try. Um, I'm gonna tell you a story from the Netherlands first, which I think there's a really important lesson for discussions about this in Britain. And then I've kind of boiled it down to three organizations, one in Switzerland, one in Colorado, and one in Wyoming, who are all they're all a similar type of organization. And I think we need organizations like this in Britain. So again, there's another lesson there. I was really inspired by them. Let me start with the bad news. Again, we'll start with the bad news or the bad example and then go to the good example. It's not really a bad example. It's from the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is a really interesting place where wolves have returned. They are doing really well. There were about 50 wolves born in the Netherlands in 2024. And this is a country that is half the size of Ireland with three times the population. It is not what you think of when you think of wolves. You think Yellowstone, you think maybe the Alps, maybe Scandinavia. You do not think the lowlands, the low countries, and the Netherlands. And yet wolves have returned there. And I'm a big fan of the Netherlands. Wherever you find innovation, you usually find Dutch people. And in rewilding innovation, you find uh, Dutch people innovating. And so over the last decade or so, as wolves have started to return to the Netherlands naturally, they've just come across the border from Germany and maybe from Belgium. Um, so that's a recolonization. And even before that recolonization occurred, before they bred, when they were just itinerant individuals coming across the border, the consortium of Dutch conservation organizations got together and said, we need to start planning for this. They reached out to the hunting lobby or organization. They got them on board. They tried to engage the agricultural union, and that didn't work, but they did ask. And then they started to engage and have dialogue with government. And so far, so good, really proactive, just like the Dutch, forward thinking, very efficient, good at planning. So the Dutch government, and this is based on an interview with one of the leading wolf ecologists in the Netherlands, who's been involved in this process over the last 10 years and more. They commissioned two really important reports. One was an ecological study, so the ecological aspect of the return of wolves to the Netherlands, and really important foundation of rewilding and conservation. The second weighty tome that they commissioned was a legal opinion on the legalities under Dutch law and European law, and also some of the complexities of under what circumstances could you haze, so like scare a wolf or remove a wolf if it was causing problems, or even shoot a wolf if it was a threat to human life, or uh, consecutively eating sheep, developing a bad habit of eating sheep. Again, really important to understand the legalities. What they didn't really commission during this same time period was any study on the cultural, the psychological, the socioeconomic, the political elements of the return of the wolf to the Netherlands. And certainly when I was there and in the interviews that I had, the challenges with the wolf returning to the Netherlands are not in the ecological aspect, because wolves just do what wolves do. they're not really in the legal aspects, although there is that conflict at European level about how easy should it be to lethally control wolves when they're causing problems. The real challenge in the Netherlands is the social and the socioeconomic, the psychological and the cultural. So the lesson for Britain and for Ireland from that, at least in my point of view, is that if we want to do this well, we can't afford to make that same mistake. We must make sure that the social aspects are front and center. And we probably even, I would argue, that we need to pay even more attention to those than the ecological, which is relatively straightforward, and the legal, which is not quite so straightforward because of human nature. Human nature is the complex, problematic bit in all of this. And that is where the real risk is. And previous attempts to reintroduce lynx to Britain, the Lynx UK Trust ill-fated attempt, was they were declined a license because of the lack of consultation. And the more recent examples, there's a consortium in Scotland and a consortium in the north of England are doing a much better job. But even there, some of the ecological studies are looking and forecasting over a 100-year period, which is the standard time period for a wildlife population. You're looking at population. Is there enough habitat and prey and genetic diversity to sustain a healthy population of lynx over 100 years in the Scottish Highlands or Northern England and Southern Scotland? Really important, really great work. But we're not, that I've seen, matching that same long-term ecological planning with long-term social planning, where we're also saying, how are we going to fund this for 100 years? Who's going to be paying to compensate when there are 400 lynx in Scotland and Northern England and they're eating, say, 5 sheep a year, 2,000 sheep, and you're going to pay for farmers to have livestock guardian dogs, compensation schemes. You're going to have to train people to manage and train and research all of that. How are we going to pay for that? And how are we going to make sure that all of the many benefits from tourism, which I think are substantial, there could be real benefits from having lynx back in the landscape and wolves from a tourism point of view, how are the economic benefits being shared with those who are paying the economic price? So I would like to see, and it's partly why I did this study and wrote this book, lots more work in that area. Not because I like telling people off and whinging and moaning, but this topic, these species, this potential is too important to get it wrong, in my perspective. And the lesson from the Netherlands as the human is that the human element is absolutely critical, and we must not get it wrong. We must get it right. That's the not so good story, although I've hopefully turned it into a good story in terms of lessons that we can learn here. The other very inspiring set of interviewees that I can only boil down to 3 organizations, and there's a really important lesson again for Britain and for Ireland too in the coming years and the coming decades. One is an organization called Agridea in Switzerland, which has a role at a national level. Switzerland is a federal nation, so lots of cantons or provinces which are semi-autonomous, and over all of them is Agridea, which provides research and training for farmers and coexisting with carnivores. So they're the ones who design the schemes about livestock guardian dogs and compensation and fencing, and then they train local agricultural colleges to work with farmers and provide technical support. They have a neutral point of view. They have multiple funders. I think they're kind of quasi-public as an organization, but they get funding at EU level and all sorts of things. Really inspiring. And the point is they're neutral. They're neither for nor against the recolonization of the Wolf, and for that reason they're seen as a trusted intermediary. In Wyoming, which is an extraordinary state, so it's 10,000 kilometers squared, bigger than Ireland, but has the population of Greater Belfast, so 600,000 people. So a lot of space, a lot of beautiful wildlife, lots of ranching. Not very fond of wolves would be the politest way to put it in some parts of the state, but it's home to most of Yellowstone National Park. And there is an organization there, which is the Department of Fish and Game's Large Carnivore Team. So they have this specialist team of large carnivore specialists who are practitioners. They are researchers. They combine doing and researching, which is really important. But my point is they're on call 365, 7 days a week, 24/7, 365, to respond to ranchers and to individuals when there's a problem with a predator. So if you have a bear that is getting into bins and is starting to become habituated to people, or a mountain lion that's eaten someone's dog, or wolves that are repeatedly killing livestock. And that animal, the farmer needs support. They need fencing, or they need a livestock guardian dog, or they need compensation, or they need that an animal's been killed and their lives, they need a verification so they can claim insurance on that. Or unfortunately, whenever predators, particularly bears, occasionally kill people, because they can be quite risky species and they do pose a threat. The point is, again, this team is on hand 24/7, 365 to respond to farmers' needs and ranchers' needs and just people in general whenever there's a problem. And again, they have this role in the middle. They are neither for nor against. They have this strong, trusted position in between. And that means, as always, when you're somewhere in between, you tend to get crap from both sides. But somebody's got to do it, and they do a very good job in difficult circumstances of providing that support. And of all people, I would reference here George Monbiot writing in Feral about the reintroduction of wolves, and he actually advocates the controlled hunting of wolves that are reintroduced to Britain, which may be something that is difficult for your listeners to accept or hear. It's something that George Monbiot finds personally distasteful. I myself have no desire to pick up a gun and go out and shoot anything. And yet he says that we need it in part to keep wolves fearful of people, but also to provide a sense of agency, that those who are losing livestock to wolves would know that if there is a real problem, something is going to be done about it. And again, my point is that in Wyoming, that large carnivore team are providing that sense of agency. When there is a problem, the rancher picks up the phone, someone comes and talks to them. Does it make the problem go away all the time? No, but someone is there to listen and to respond. And that is really important when we start to think about the procedures and organizations that we would need in these islands to respond to and manage coexistence with large carnivores. And the last example in that vein of neutral, trusted intermediary organizations is the Colorado State University's Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence. And they've had a really important role in researching and working on the mandated reintroduction of wolves. So in 2020, there was a citizens ballot initiative that mandated wolves be reintroduced to Colorado by the end of 2023, which they were. And that process was very tightly contested at the ballot box. It was something like 50.5 to 49.5% out of 3 million votes, tighter than Brexit. And also what made it more complicated is the eastern part of the state, which is Greater Denver, running down this broad valley length of the state, voted yes, and the more rural western parts where wolves are going to be reintroduced voted no. Again, parallels with Brexit. So it's a bit of a minefield how do you get popular support for a reintroduction plan when half the people in the state really don't want it to happen? And yet that center at CSU has done a really good job of studying that, of being involved in it, of bringing together lots of different stakeholders with different perspectives. And of course, not everybody is happy. Not everybody can be happy with everything all of the time. But again, the importance of, like with Agridea in Switzerland and like with the large carnivore unit in Wyoming, the importance of trusted intermediaries that can speak to everybody. And that is partly why I have chosen this position. I'm not neutral on large carnivores because I love large carnivores, but I am neutral about their potential return to these islands, as I've already hinted, but also because I have a foot in the farming camp and a foot in the large carnivore camp. I speak fluent farmer, I speak fluent conservationist. I love both ways of life and ways of being dearly. There is a need for roles like that to be in the middle and to bring people together and to translate. And whether that's me or whether there are many other people who are quite capable and organizations of doing that, we need people like that. It cannot become an us and them, zero-sum, polarized conflict, because that is going to lead to bad outcomes for everyone and everything and everywhere. So we need to see it as a spectrum of perspectives. We need people in the middle who can mediate, and we probably need organizations or structures put in place that we probably don't have yet. What organization will play that role in Scotland? What organization will play that in England? Will it be Natural England? Will it be Nature Scotland? I don't know. And these are the sort of things we need to be talking about. They probably are being discussed. They're probably some of the things that are going to come out in 2025 because we have had this consultation on the reintroduction of links to Scotland. So these discussions are happening. I have lots to say on it in my book. And again, I would signpost the importance of social science and even the humanities in this because, as I said earlier, coexistence with predators is less about conflict between people and predators and more about conflict between people over predators. So how do you make peace between people with wildly different perspectives, between the rancher or the farmer and between the rewilder and the reintroducer? It's not through natural science. I'm not even sure it's through social science. It's through methodologies that we bring from peace building. And it's something in this country that perhaps we in Northern Ireland, through the peace process, have made great strides and learned. We need to apply those methodologies of making peace with each other, not only to making peace with nature, but to making peace with each other over nature, to make peace between the rewilder and the farmer, between the reintroducer and the rancher. So processes, people, organizations, and those sort of processes that sit in the middle and bring people together and build bridges in this debate as it plays out in the coming years and decades are. I can't stress enough how important this is.
Wow. And finally, Dr. Hanson, where can people find you, find your book, find the report, or just, where can they find you to support you in general?
Yeah, so well, I'm all over social media at Jonny, JONNY Hanson, HANSON. Maybe you could put some of those social media
Yeah.
handles in the show notes. You can also get me on my website, johnnyhanson.com, and I have a quarterly newsletter. I don't believe in spamming people with weekly emails. It cracks me up. So you get a quarterly email from me, which has all my news, working at this intersection of conservation and agriculture and enterprise. And I'm also in my role at Queen's University starting to work on bringing these peace building methodologies into the environmental space, which I think we sorely need. The report is already out. You'll get it on my Linktree links. If you go on social media, go to Linktree, you'll see the report is out there and the video of that. And the book out at the end of January is available to buy in any good bookshop and online. So please read that and join the debate because while the report is more technical and focused on helping policymakers, whether agricultural, public, or rewilding, think about the practicalities of coexisting with carnivores, the book is just a really good story. It's not an academic book, although there's lots of science in it. It's a really good story. And it's my adventure traveling across the world, back in time, as we've said, into the human psyche, and just exploring how I feel about it. And it's also meant to stimulate further discussion and debate and also to discuss about how we might debate this. How do we find ways to coexist with each other? And that is a question that goes far beyond just lynx, wolves, and bears. That's important in every aspect of life. So stay tuned. Please do buy the book and read it and get in touch. Let me know what you think. And just be inspired by, at the end of the day, I hope in the book, while I do spend a lot of time talking about the challenges of living with large carnivores, and they can be considerable, and we've spent a lot of time in this podcast talking about the challenges and how do we stop bad things from happening and deal with bad things. We have evolved to have this extraordinary relationship with nature. And of all the species in nature, for me at least, the ones that stand out are large carnivores, those apex predators, lynx, wolves, bears. It's snow leopards for me. There is something phenomenal about them, and sharing this world with them, making sure that we have a planet that provides the capacity for us to flourish alongside large carnivores. Whether or not that includes Britain and Ireland, that remains to be seen, is a motivating factor in it's why I get up every day. And it's something to be really excited about. The fact that we're even having this conversation in Britain and Ireland is pretty cool.
Dr. Hanson, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jack.